Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking from RWK Goodman, with me, Ed Wotton, and my co-host, Liam Pape.
Hello!
This week we've got Holli Rubin, who's a psychologist, therapist and social worker and head of wellbeing at the Soke. And we've also got our very own Catherine Hawkes from our employment team to talk about menopause. So yeah, it was a really good conversation we had, wasn't it, Liam?
Yes, one of the main things we discuss is to remove the stigma around talking about menopause and issues relating to that, as well as some practical advice is dispensed in this episode as well. Yeah.
And I think one of the most surprising things about addressing issues related to menopause in the workplace is that it's not something that will just benefit women. So yeah, really interesting conversation.
Roll tape. So Holli, first question to you, and we'll start with maybe the basics, which is what is the menopause and the perimenopause, and what are the symptoms that women experience?
Sure. So the perimenopause, menopause time in a woman's life is varied, and it can go anywhere from early 40s through till mid 50s. So it's really quite a long period of time. And part of the mystery around this time in a woman's life is that many times women don't even realize that they're experiencing what they're experiencing, that the symptoms that they're in fact are having are not necessarily related to this time of their lives. So that part can really stump women and can be really confusing. So it's a time in our lives when women are undergoing changes. Changes are physical, physiological, emotional, all encompassing. It's a really holistic experience, actually, and it can be really challenging.
And I think part of that challenge is some of the stigma that surrounds the menopause. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of educating both women and men about this?
It is so important to educate around this because, well, first of all, women have to know what's happening to them, and they have to understand the symptoms so that they can appreciate what they're going through and understand what is happening to them so that they can make some connections and they can link some dots so that they can understand what is happening and why they might be experiencing certain things that they hadn't been experiencing before. And very, very important to include men in this conversation so that men too can understand why the women around them might be experiencing certain things and might be behaving in an atypical fashion.
You mentioned earlier that the menopause also can affect kind of mood and physiological elements as well. So how does the menopause impact mental health and well-being, and what can women do to support their own well-being during this time?
So symptoms can be, and again, I think there's around 64 and counting, but they can be anything from, they are not just the typical hot flashes, which we tend to think of when we talk about menopause or perimenopause. So that is a common symptom. But it's not the only symptom. Again, it ranges from memory lapse to brain fog to anxiety to depression to forgetfulness to all of these things that can happen. Just forgetting things, for dropping names, so much so that women's confidence is really takes a hit at that time of their lives. And because they're not necessarily understanding that those symptoms are attributed to this time in their life, a lot of what happens is really detrimental, and that there's quite a bit of self-doubt that goes around with that. And consequently, overall self-esteem and overall confidence can drop. We see that in the numbers at work. We see, I think it's 1 in 10 actually, that make a decision to not go back to work because they feel that they're not performing the way that they had been before. So we really need to look at this as an issue that affects everyone, really, not just women, not just men, but employers and medical doctors, all of this. We all have to be really aware of what's happening and support and educate at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I guess that from just bringing on to Catherine's side of things, from the employment law perspective, what do you see is the impact of the menopause on women at work?
Yeah, so there's a really significant impact on women at work. I mean, just some of those symptoms which Holli outlined can be really debilitating for a woman, and it can really impact on her quality of working life, and it can also negatively impact her performance. But I think one of the biggest issues of the menopause on women at work is that it can sometimes cause women to want to leave their current job or to leave the workplace altogether and retire early. And so this can have a really negative, detrimental impact and have a bit of a knock-on effect kind of in business and industry generally, because women will typically be leaving work at the peak of their careers, sort of between the ages of 45 and 55. And this can impact on diversity and inclusion efforts in organizations, because there'll be a loss of sort of very senior female leaders within organizations, and there'll be a real loss of skills and experience which these women have, but also a lack of sort of role models for younger women who are kind of climbing up the ranks within an organization. So it can really have a very wide-ranging impact at work. So employers need to be really alive to the issue. And like Holli was saying, there needs to be a lot more awareness and education about the menopause in this area.
So a question for both of you then. What actually can employers do to support women who are going through the menopause? Holli, should we come to you first?
Yeah, again, such a good question. And it's just making me think, Catherine, about what you said, that women juggle so often throughout their entire careers and their entire lives that often for a woman to get to that place, she's had to already sacrificed quite a bit in terms of childcare, in terms of all these challenges that women and families face as a result of having women in the workforce. So to that point, it's such a shame that we are seeing women drop out at that point. And it really reinforces that fact, Catherine, that we do have to support at work. And the way in which women can be supported at work is being able to have these conversations, to be able to ban this taboo, if you will, and not see it as a topic with which we can't have a conversation anymore about. We have to talk about what's happening and what's going on so that we can normalize perimenopause and menopause as a very regular stage that women undergo. There's nothing abnormal about it. It has been happening for years and years and years. We just haven't been talking about it and addressing it. And it's in the silence where this stays problematic. So having conversations, destigmatizing, making people aware that it could just be over lunch, it could be over a coffee, it could be facilitated by leaving the office and having little mini micro breaks that we can all benefit from, not just women in perimenopause and menopause, but actually leaving the desk and going for a walk around the block is important for us all and all of our mental health. So being able to do that and maybe talk loosely around what some of the symptoms might be, what might some symptoms be occurring at that time without having to feel shame around it.
And Catherine, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think maybe more of a sort of practical aspect for employers, what they could do is think about giving training to line managers and employees about the menopause, what the symptoms are, and how to actually deal and manage somebody that's going through the menopause. But also to have a menopause policy that actually sets out some guidance around the menopause and what to do when issues arise. Employees can also think about sort of more practical, reasonable adjustments to the workplace itself. So, for example, having good ventilation, having fans, and the ability to control sort of the temperature within the office, and sort of really small practical adjustments that employees can do that can actually have a huge impact. But also, I think what's really important is for employers to demonstrate to employees that they actually take the issue really seriously. And so if there are any grievances or if any employee raises issues about discrimination, that they take a really robust approach when it comes to sort of discrimination relating to menopause, in the same way that they would deal with any types of discrimination in the workplace. And also thinking about sort of flexibility as well. So allowing women to have more flexible hours and to be able to have time off. And I think that's like sort of really, really important sort of adjustments that you can make for women. And also just speaking to women and asking them like individually what would actually help them, because so you're not actually making sort of a one size fits all approach for everybody, but you're actually speaking to people individually about what actually would help them personally. So lots of things for employers to think about, really.
Yeah, sounds like it. And I guess in terms of things that employers have to think about, on the flip side of this, when they do it wrong, what are the potential, I mean, you mentioned about discrimination kind of claims there. What are the potential legal implications of mismanaging this kind of thing? Yeah,
so discrimination, absolutely. So while the menopause isn't actually a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, if an employee is treated less favourably or put at a disadvantage because of their menopause symptoms, then they may have claims for either sex, age, or disability discrimination under the Equality Act. And if an employer has more than 2 years service, they will be able to bring a claim potentially for unfair dismissal or constructive unfair dismissal, which is where an employee resigns in response to their employer's conduct. So there are a number of sort of avenues and routes which employees can go through, but there are challenges. There are challenges with the fact that the menopause isn't a protected characteristic, and sometimes that can cause quite a lot of hurdles. So there are lots of discussions between employment lawyers about and sort of campaigns for the menopause to actually be a protected characteristic under the Equality Act to kind of help those sort of challenges that the women face.
And just to throw an extra unplanned question into the works, obviously there's a lot of talk at the moment about menstrual leave and stuff like that. And there's obviously, when talking about that, a lot of people that are coming up and saying we should just destigmatize sick leave in general. And if the last few years have seen anything on COVID and everything like that, we should perhaps be more willing to give people the time to either work from home when they need to, or, take the time off so that they can work more effectively. Is that, in terms of the changes being brought about in this kind of the more awareness of the menopause, is that then going to help, more? I mean, we mentioned at the start, Holli, you mentioned this is potentially beneficial towards men, not just women, to try and understand this kind of thing. Is taking more action on things like that going to benefit everyone in the long run?
I think the answer to that simply is yes, actually, that to be able to take all of that into account and to be able to, once again, normalize symptoms that women have during perimenopause and menopause and just see them as symptomatic of life stages, right? The same way pregnancy might be, the same way, a regular headache, a regular migraine, whatnot. All of these things pose and impact our capacity to work effectively. So yes, wouldn't it be nice if all of that could sort of fall under an umbrella and just be able to give employees the time that they need to recuperate so that they can better do their job.
Yeah. And is it as simple as that, Catherine? I'm sure you'll tell us it probably isn't.
Well, I mean, I think allowing people to have time off if they're going through the menopause is really important, and it could amount to a reasonable adjustment. So where the menopause, where the symptoms of the menopause are so serious, they could potentially amount to a disability under the Equality Act. And then there is a requirement of an employer to make reasonable adjustments where there is where an individual has a disability. And if one of those adjustments would be to allow them to have more time off, paid leave to sort of recuperate and have more regular rest, then absolutely it's essential. I mean, in practical terms, sometimes it is difficult, but that just goes all back to the sort of the education, the awareness piece, that once more people know and understand how serious it can be, people are a little bit more, understanding and empathetic about the whole situation.
And also, if we think about that in terms of the bottom line, right, it's always going to be more advantageous to give somebody time off than it would be for them to leave and then for you to have to retrain someone. So I think thinking bigger picture and long term, it's really important to consider that too.
Yeah. Great. Anything you wanted to add, Liam?
Nothing else from me. Catherine and Holly, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to delve into?
I had a question for Holly, actually. So obviously, one of the great things about having a menopause policy is you provide loads of guidance to employers about how to actually deal with the menopause. And that's all well and good if it's all written down. But in practical terms, if you, say, have a male manager trying to talk to a female about perhaps the symptoms that they're experiencing and what they're going through, I just wondered if you had any sort of tips and guidance about how to have those conversations and sort of approach that.
I think, good question again. I think that we at the Soke are working towards helping train actually employees around having those kinds of conversations so that they are taken more seriously, actually, and being able to have more empathic and open dialogue around these things. So specifics, it would probably be helpful to have prior to a conversation to be able to write some things down and to actually have some points where these are the symptoms. This is what's happening to me. I'm, enduring a lot of brain fog. Consequently, at board meeting, like I'll give you an example. At board meetings, for example, it's really difficult perhaps to remember the names of my colleagues if something comes up, or the name of a date, in an act that I might need to represent, whatever it is. If an employer knows about that prior to the meeting, they also can help facilitate the conversation so that the person is not under pressure, so that the person can share what they know without worrying about forgetting something or forgetting the things that they know might be a challenge for them at that moment. So by being open initially, they can be helped in those situations that might be causing them more stress at this time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yeah.
So again, we're happy to sort of help guide some of those conversations should you need to, because I think it is important to have concrete. We know, we can say there's 64 symptoms, but of course they're going to be different for every individual. Not every individual is going to have all of those. They're going to have some. They might have some in the beginning of their menopause journey that they don't have anymore. So it's really helpful to have that conversation ongoing, actually, and to be able to touch base in a way whereby there are concrete examples of what they're struggling with, and there can be solutions to those things if they know how to ask the questions.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's really important because sometimes it's not always a sort of an employer issue. Managers may have to signpost to the relevant resource, such as the Soke or, GPs, or occupational health, because sometimes it is something that can't actually be dealt with. But signposting is always really important.
Exactly. And there is always help out there. So I think that that's also really important for people to know, employers and employees, just to know that there is help, and that part of this is about being able to have the strength and the support to speak up and say, you know what, I do need some help.
Great. Well, our previous podcast that was related to employment was about EVP, and the end comment on that was listen to your people. But it sounds like also communicate with your people is very important in this case as well. So sounds like we've covered everything, unless I'm speaking out of turn. So I guess I'll just say thanks, Holly, and thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Really good to end on a very practical note there, as we did with our EVP podcast. As with most things related to employment, I imagine, but it seems to be in our experience, is just being able to have an open and honest conversation with people about the issues that they're facing and how they can be solved is, incredibly important and solves a lot of issues. What did you take from it, Liam?
I thought it was interesting how there was almost two levels of almost advice that we gave to employers, or I say we, that Catherine gave to employers. And one of them is kind of the starting way of doing it, which is having these frank conversations and kind of destigmatizing the menopause. And then secondly, some of the practical things that employers can do. And that goes further than a menopause policy, which is great, but it is things like, as she said, good ventilation and fans, and being able to offer flexible hours, and kind of almost a wider point of destigmatizing sick leave. But maybe that's for another podcast completely, because I think that's an issue in and of itself. But yes, a big thank you to Catherine and Holli for their expertise there.
Absolutely right. Thanks, Liam. Bit of a postscript from me now to say that our latest report, this time into the state of social care, emerging from the storm, is out now, and be sure to subscribe for a podcast with more leading experts in the field of social care next week. So if you want to find out more, make sure to go to rwkgoodman.com/social care storm, all one word. Otherwise, be sure to leave us a like, a review, whatever works for you. Thanks for listening.